Okay, for this lecture I'm going to go over the fundamentals of comparison and contrast as a rhetorical mode, how you should approach this essay, some of my expectations and the requirements of this essay, and also give you some pointers on how to best do this essay. Now, you may have seen that I've postponed the due date for the essay to October 9th. That is a week from, or sorry, November 9th. That is a week from today. So its due date is 9 November 2015 by 11:59 p.m. For this essay, you have a few requirements I want to emphasize, and I've been emphasizing some of these all semester long, but I think it's important to re-emphasize them considering some students are still making these mistakes. MLA guidelines are required. So that means to check your paper against the pages in Writing Matters that show a model MLA paper. Those pages, just in case you have forgotten, are 337 through 46. And they literally have glosses, notes that tell you exactly how your paper should be formatted, right down to how many spaces between certain objects, the title, and that sort of thing. So please use that resource. I'm going to be grading this paper in a much more strict fashion, even if I'm not giving more line-by-line comments. Since this paper and the last paper are really, the cause and effect essay are really your most academic papers of the semester. So the next thing is absolutely no use of second person. So if you don't know your pronouns and your point of view, that is you, your, or you are, or its variant, the contraction your. Any use of those is incorrect usage. If you need justification, read things that make teaching writers or writing teachers cringe, which leads me to my next point. Be sure to proofread and apply things that make teaching writers cringe before submitting. Very, very important, because many of you are making mistakes that are clearly dealt with in that document. Clearly dealt with in that document. You should not be making those mistakes this late in the semester, and you still are. So I don't want to see any of those mistakes in this paper. Use academic tone. So no colloquialism, no slang, no announcements, none of that other rubbish. I want this to read like an academic paper. Must have at least one database article. Now, for this module, you should have been working already on the information literacy tutorial. So let's go to that real quick on our library webpage. So let me open the window so you can see it. Okay. The fastest way to our library webpage is to click library.lsco.edu. That brings up a page that looks like this. If you are off campus, you will need to enter login information. I forget what exactly that login information is. It should be your username and password that you use to get onto my LSCO. You can always contact the librarians to find out. You're going to go to all databases. Databases A to Z, academic search complete. You're going to go in here and you're going to click full text, and you are going to try to get something more recent so you can control the date here. You want to make sure that it is coming from a periodical, so select periodical, and you want to make sure that it is an article, select article. Preferably you'll want to click scholarly, but that might not always get you enough items to have your research, so you might need to uncheck that. The key here is that you try a bunch of different ways of searching. Do not give up and email me and say I can't find anything the first time you search, because I'm going to tell you to keep searching. That's all I'm going to tell you, because research is work and you have to keep trying different types of searches to find information. So you must have at least one database article. That means it has to come from academic search complete, sometimes referred to as EBSCOhost, or I know many of the high schools use Gale, although Gale has its own issues. So you want to make sure that if it is coming from Gale, that it is an academic article. That means it is peer reviewed, has a list of sources, bibliography, references, or in our case called the works cited. If it doesn't have those two things, it's not academic. It's a newspaper article or a magazine article, and that is useful, but you still need to have at least one database article for this paper to cite. Okay. May use other sources in addition to the database article, but must apply the CRAP test to them. And if you completed the information literacy tutorial, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so what is comparison and contrast? It is a rhetorical mode where two subjects are compared. Let's do this. Two subjects, similarities and differences are explored. So as the rhetorical mode requires, though, you need to have a few elements in order to do this. So first off, this mode is typically written for a specific audience. In this case, academic. It is informative and persuasive. That means it needs to give detailed evidence and it needs to have a purpose. So what I've been asking my students that I meet face-to-face with when they present me with a hypothesis about the result of their comparison and contrast is I keep asking them, okay, so what is useful in this? It's not just like a competition between, you know, two public figures. It's why is it important to compare those two public figures? What can we gain from that comparison? What sort of knowledge can we gain? What meaningful knowledge? How is that knowledge meaningful to us? Very, very important that that's clear to your reader in your thesis. A good example of a paper, a student style paper that has a meaningful comparison is that student paper in the chapter 16 on page 385, Border Bites by Heather Giannakos. I warn you, when you read it, it's going to make you hungry. It's a very good paper as a model for you. And you can see in there, if you turn to it with me, on page 386, that we have a thesis statement. The different traditions and geographic locations of the inhabitants of Mexico and the Anglo-American settlers in the Southwest have resulted in subtle, flavorful differences between the foods featured in Mexican and Southwestern cuisine. So this is literally an exploration of how these two different cultures have created a new sort of cuisine, and that's what makes it important. That's what makes it interesting. So you need to do something along those lines to help you make this argument, to make this paper interesting, persuasive, and informative, as we say. Okay, so your paper has to have an article from a database. It has to be an academic tone. You cannot use second person. So how do you make something persuasive where you cannot directly speak to your audience? How can you make something persuasive where you cannot directly address your audience and where you can't use an really, I don't want to say an interesting tone, but you can't use an entertaining tone. You can't use a lot of humor and sarcasm and wit. How do you convince? Well, you have to have evidence. Facts are key to this essay. And this is something I've been emphasizing a lot to my face-to-face students. This is why the database article is so important. This is why this is the most academic of papers that you've written so far. You have to have evidence from reliable sources, and the evidence needs to be factual, unbiased as much as possible, objective evidence. So if you're comparing two public figures, you don't want to compare them based on your own biases. You may be a Republican and hate Hillary Clinton, but that cannot enter into your paper. If you choose to write a paper comparing Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, you cannot show undue bias. You cannot say that Hillary Clinton is untrustworthy without evidence that she has lied a lot and Donald Trump has not lied a lot. And that evidence has to come from sources, not just parents and friends and one type of source, let's say Fox News or MSNBC. It has to come from multiple sources. So facts from differing viewpoints, be balanced in your presentation, do not reveal your personal preference unless it is clearly based on your research. So this is the most scientific of papers in a sense. Your goal here is to have your thesis be purely research based. So if you want to say that Ben Carson would make a better president than Marco Rubio, you have to base that on research. And your points of comparison, which is the next part I'm going to talk about here, are important because that will guide your research. So you have to have a minimum of 3 points of comparison. Each item compared must be roughly parallel. What I mean by this is you wouldn't compare, at least I hope you wouldn't compare, a compact car to a full-size truck because they are designed with different goals in mind. A more realistic comparison would be two types of full-size trucks. So the same thing's true for comparing people, for comparing fashion, for comparing ideas. You want them to be roughly parallel, of the same quality, of the same level. This will make it easier. This makes it easier to have meaningful points of comparison. So what is a meaningful point of comparison? A meaningful point of comparison is a trait or quality shared by both subjects that can be factually analyzed and compared. Okay, so let me give you an example. For example, I want to compare computers. I pick Apple and I pick Dell. I can come up with points of comparison for this because all computers have RAM. I can compare their RAM. All computers have monitors, display monitors. I can compare that. All computers have hard drives. That could be a point of comparison. All computers require software to run. I can compare their software and what software comes with them. All computers have a set price point. I can compare and contrast that. And I could go on and on all day. Whereas if I wanted to compare an Apple computer to a Samsung Nexus tablet, that is not a parallel. Even though they share some of these qualities, they're different. They're designed to do different things. One is primarily an entertainment device. One is primarily a content creation device. It would be better to compare it to an iPad. That would be a parallel comparison. So you can see what I'm talking about there. So you have to have these points of comparison. Once you've established points of comparison, let's undo that. I'm going to actually delete that so that we can keep the outline format. So once you have your points of comparison, then you have to decide you have points of comparison. Decide on an organizational principle. So you have two possible organizational principles: point by point, subject by subject. And I am actually not going to go over these in depth. There are models for them. Point by point is shown in a graphic organizer on page 373. And subject by subject is shown in a graphic organizer on page 374 as an outline. You definitely want to read the models in the textbook, okay? You want to read the models because they will help you create this paper. So let me talk for a bit about your prompts. Let's talk for a bit about your prompts. What is the prompt for compare, contrast? Your prompts are on page 380 of Successful College Writing. You've probably already looked at them. I hope you have. Now, do not, I am going to block some of these, do not write on two forms of entertainment. And I do not want a comparison. Do not compare teachers, as the second one has, our teaching styles. I don't want that comparison. So anything else on here is fair game. You can use styles of communication, public figures, right or wrong ways of doing something, two different cultural views on men and women, but I do not want the entertainment ones. I'm tired of reading papers about movies. And I don't want you to compare teachers, because that's just a recipe for disaster, usually for students, since it's really tough to evaluate how a teacher is functioning from a student standpoint. Be sure you read the model on 385 and spend some time analyzing it. As I said, you have to use one database article for this, but you can use websites, you can use books, you can use as many other sources as you need. They just need to be cited properly, both in text and in secondary sources. And you need to make sure that every time you paraphrase or quote something, you use the signal phrase, proper punctuation, and the parenthetical. So that's all I have for you today on these notes. If you have any questions about them, please email me. I'm going to post this both in content in the module and also on the news feed. So, and I'll post these notes with it as well.